Good evening, everybody. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but everything is fine now. So good evening, everyone. And I am Nozizwe Dube, and I am the coordinator of Undivided for KU Leuven. I'm just going to give a short little speech just to start off the evening because I know you all came from somebody else, so I'm not going to keep you from that. But welcome to our lecture on Decolonization of Academia, the current situation of sexual minority rights in Uganda, and the bridging of the gap between activists and the academic world. I am going to shortly explain what Undivided is and what it is that we do, and of course, why we decided to organize this specific event. So Undivided is a student-led organization actively working on inclusion in the University of Leuven. We are able to do this with a team of wonderful volunteers who put their heart and soul into the two topics that we are focusing on at the moment. So LGBTQIA students, LGBTQIA+ students, and decolonization of academia. The main goal of Undivided is to make the university more inclusive on the three domains the university is working on, so namely education, research, and public service. Undivided brings students and staff together to make diversity more visible, to influence the policy, and of course, to learn from each other. There's a lot of diversity within the university itself, but we believe that the different marginalized voices are not equally heard or recognized. We want to influence policy regarding diversity, and we are doing this through participating in decision-making councils, and by raising our voice, we want to influence policy in a constructive manner. We also want to learn from each other. We believe that being an intersectional space where people can meet, listen, and learn from each other is an important aspect of creating an open and a diverse culture. A few years ago, the South African student movement Rhodes Must Fall caught my eye. As someone born in Zimbabwe herself, formerly known as Rhodesia under colonial rule, I was intrigued to know more. Rhodesia was derived from the name of British colonialist Cecil John Rhodes. As a law student at the University of Leuven, I started to think actively about how what I was studying in so many courses is still drenched in a lot of colonial rhetoric, and mostly how harmful this was for not only myself, but for all the other hundreds of law students who sat with me in my classes. And I know this is also the case for students in many other courses in the university. It was therefore an organic choice for us as Undivided to focus on this topic, seeing as the Rhodes Must Fall movement also set foot at Western universities such as Oxford University. And naturally, as we started this topic, there were suddenly many questions being raised, such as, why is our course on global fundamental philosophy only focusing on Western male philosophers? Are they really the only ones who shaped the world as we know it to be today? Why is it that which is defined as being the norm is strictly white and Eurocentric? Everything else that does not fit in this notion is not regarded as being scholarly or not fundamental to the world as we know it today. When research is being done, why are decisions being made to solely center and poise Western white academics as the norm? When courses are being made, why is Western-oriented research poised as the main curricula for all students, and everything else other than that is poised as an elective that only a few students can choose to study? What role do universities as hubs of research and knowledge have to play in this evolution in the academic world? Where are the Black researchers and researchers of color within the academic institution, especially in our own University of Leuven? Are they adequately supported and treated with the same amount of respect as their counterparts? And which institutional obstacles are put in their way on the road to doctoral candidateship or to being a professor? So there are so many questions that need to be answered, and there's no better expert to have here today than Professor Sylvia Tamale. Professor Sylvia Tamale is a leading African feminist lawyer and scholar based in Kampala, Uganda. She holds a Bachelor of Laws from Makerere University, a Master's in Law from Harvard Law School, and a PhD in Sociology and Feminist Studies from the University of Minnesota. She was also the first female Dean of Law at Makerere University and has been a visiting professor at several academic institutions around the world. So one of her publications is African Sexualities, a Reader. She has won several awards for defending the human rights of marginalized groups such as women, sex workers, homosexuals, and refugees. So I'm looking forward to this lecture, and I hope you are too. Give a round of applause to our speaker, Professor Sylvia Tamale.
Thank you very much, Nozizwe. Good evening, everyone. First, she promised that I'll talk about LGBTQ status in Uganda right now. It was difficult for me to add on that subject to this important topic. So I'll be more than happy to discuss it during the Q&A if the question is asked, but it's not part of the paper that I'm going to present. First, I would like to thank the Metaforum Institute at KU Leuven, who are responsible for my presence at your beautiful university as a visiting scholar. Secondly, I'm grateful to the leadership of Undivided for inviting me here tonight. It is a singular honor for me to address you and would like to thank each one of you for making time to come here this evening in this weather. I have to say that I really like the name of this initiative, Undivided. It speaks to all the issues that we are going to discuss tonight regarding decolonization. We are going to talk about the ideals of a single, holistic, undivided humanity, at least undivided in the fundamentals of human life. The term undivided is incompatible with colonization and anathema to imperialism. It is a term that rejects isolationism, nationalism, and chauvinism, all of which have become prominent features of the early 21st century world in which we currently live. So for an initiative that seeks to make the university more inclusive, to embrace diversity, you could not have selected a better name. Congratulations. Now, the term decolonization has gained a lot of currency in recent times and is of most importance to people who have been oppressed and dehumanized for decades, even centuries. But in order to fully understand the concept, one needs to appreciate the history of capitalism, which is tied to the emergence of the modern state, and how the two facilitated the colonial project. The colonial era that commenced with Christopher Columbus's invasion of the Americas in the 15th century globalized racism and exploitation. Integral to all colonial institutions was racism, which dehumanized the colonized. Colonialism was consolidated with the subsequent invasions of Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries and Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was characterized by slavery, wanton killings and abductions, land grabbing, military recruitment, displacement, forced resettlement, and migration. Actions that the United Nations today refers to as genocide and crimes against humanity. The time for this evening's lecture is too short to delve into the expansive political economy of colonialism. Suffice it to state that there is a dialectical relationship between colonialism, capitalism, nationalism, globalization, racism, sexism, and most of the other isms and egoteries that foster inequalities and dehumanization. A rich body of scholarship, most of it authored by scholars of race, gender, and sexuality, exists in book titles such as How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Capitalism and Slavery, African Gender Studies, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, and Gender Trouble, so many more. The discussion tonight promises to cause discomfort and unease for many in the room. This is because everyone in the world is affected by colonization. It is structural, it is institutional, it is systemic, and it is affective. All of us, even those responsible for its perpetuation, are victims of internalized colonialism. Its logic is deeply ingrained in our daily lives. That is how powerful and pervasive colonialism and its legacies are. Some of us are privileged and valorized, by colonial oppression and hegemony, while others are dehumanized and decivilized by it. Very few of us would dare admit the extent that colonialism and neocolonialism affects us. The impulse is to either be defensive or offensive. My appeal is that tonight we all step back and engage in serious self-reflection and introspection as we collectively try to understand the fraught and complex issues of this global transnational phenomenon. As intellectuals in the academy, it is our duty. Nay, it is our obligation to do so. It is useful to speak of colonialism at two fundamental levels. The first involved the expropriation of indigenous worlds by imperial colonizers. This form included the appropriation of indigenous peoples and their ecological spaces for the benefit of imperialism. This type of colonization symbolically ended with flag independence. However, as we all know, flag independence did not effectively end the exploitation, oppression, and violence of imperialism in the former colonies. The hetero-capitalist system, facilitated by nation states, continues to extract from ex-colonies to feed the insatiable appetites of colonial powers. Colonized lands continue to supply cheap labor, minerals, oil, sand, cash and food crops, fish, etc., for the benefit of both capitalism and colonialism. The post-colonial subjects continue to suffer and their environment continues to be depleted under the hands of imperialists and their agents on the ground, that is the indigenous comprador elites. The multilateral institutions driving the colonial machinery and using mostly US capital include the World Bank, IMF, WTO, EU, the UN, and the Commonwealth. China is the latest dynamic in the neocolonial world order. The second form of colonization was, and still is, much more insidious and dangerous. It operates in subtle and benign ways. Its ideologies are inculcated into us through institutions such as education, religion, laws, family, language, corrupted cultural practices, and mass media, including print, broadcast, and social. It involves the colonization of the minds, patterns of knowledge, and social structures of indigenous peoples. Knowledge production, or what and how we understand reality and truth, is an extremely political process. What is reality or truth, or what philosophers refer to as ontology? How do we know this reality? What philosophers refer to as epistemology. Is there only one reality, or are there many realities? Are these realities or these truths universal? In the world we live in today, knowledge structures are shaped by colonial ontology and epistemology. Most approaches to these philosophical questions are answered by mainstream colonial values and colonial ways of knowing and being. Such approaches reinforce colonial hegemonic relations. In this era of bot algorithms, the sky is the limit for constructing and sustaining such master narratives. The access by privileged groups to power is not so much a result of their personal effort, but simply a function of the groups to which individuals belong. Their place in the social hierarchy, as well as their access to power, is the consequence of factors such as race, gender, socioeconomic class, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, disability, and so on. If you belong to the right group, then privilege is conferred on you as a matter of course. In other words, you don't have to earn it like a degree. If you belong to the wrong group, then you are stigmatized and discredited. The culture of the colonizer is evident everywhere in the colonies. Language, dress, music, holidays, housing, sports, and so forth. This form of colonization renders the identity of the colonized a very precarious unity. Their children are born to fit into the colonizers' prefabricated molds and act out the colonizers' predetermined script. So when we speak of decolonization, the process of breaking free must target both levels of colonization if it is to be effective. This evening, I'm specifically focusing on decolonization of the academy, the space for teaching, learning, and producing knowledge. The academy has been described as, and I quote, the epicenter of colonial hegemony, indoctrination, and mental colonization, end quotes. The great philosopher Frantz Fanon told us that decolonizing the mind was the first step towards dismantling imperialism. In other words, I'm focusing on a single element of a much broader and complex web of colonizing structures and imperatives. Somebody from this university asked me the other day, what's decolonization got to do with us? It has everything to do with you, because Europe does not exist outside the rest of the world. The current Mediterranean migration crisis, for example, has its roots in coloniality and Europe modernity. In fact, decolonization has everything to do with all human beings that believe in social justice. We all remember the political slogan, 99%, coined by the Occupy Wall Street protests of 2011. That percentage signified the gross inequalities between the masses and the minority 1% of the population that benefit from the spoils of imperialism. The current Yellow Vests movement in France is about decolonization, as are the London Climate Rebellion, the Black Lives Matter campaign, the Me Too movement, and so many others that have been prominent actors in the resistance against the various isms that have plagued the world for centuries. The irony is that our failure to connect such issues to decolonization is precisely why we need to seriously engage with it. The neocolonial machinery is so efficient that it distorts historical and contemporary oppression. And therein lies the power and perversion of coloniality. But before we delve into a discussion of decolonizing minds, we must fully appreciate how they were colonized in the first place. What is it that we are trying to deconstruct in the colonized mind? So how minds are colonized? The phrase colonized mind was coined by the Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire. He was attempting to describe the invisible ways that colonizers continue with their oppression even after dismantling the physical architecture of colonialism. He highlighted the flaws in the pedagogical approaches of the contemporary education system, where both the teacher and the student play a mechanistic and passive role in the learning process. Freire criticized the dominant teaching method, where students are viewed as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge transmitted by their teachers. The incorrect assumption underlying this method is that the student lacks any knowledge and the teacher possesses all of it. The colonial education system is set up in such a way that the participants are largely unaware of their roles as colonizer or colonized. Both are caught in the grip of the colonial relationship. It is all hidden in the curricula, policies, textbooks, authority structures, credentialism, methods, cultural contexts, and the overall hegemonic discourses. Sometimes there will be a rejection on the part of the teacher and/or the student, but overall, these pockets of resistance amount to small ripples that hardly cause a dent in the dominant and hegemonic forces. Colonialism affects the way we think, the way we speak, and the way we act. We all internalize its worldview, including its constructed superiority and inferiority statuses. This is what makes colonialism so insidious. Decolonization refers to a process of deconstructing colonial interpretations and analysis of the social world. This is very much in line with what Fanon had in mind when he wrote Wretched of the Earth. For the colonized, decolonization of the mind is really about returning to the annals of history to find themselves, to become fluent in their cultural knowledge systems, to cultivate critical consciousness, and to reclaim their humanity. What makes colonization of the mind so effective is that its constructions are made to appear natural. When something is presented as natural, logic transmits the message that it is inevitable and unchangeable. It works to justify racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, and all those isms that we live with on a daily basis. Naturalization and normalization of social hierarchies are derived from ideas such as divine laws. So in order to effectively break this cycle of colonization, we must fully understand the concept of decolonization and how it can set us on the road to more dignified ways for all living in this world. I will proceed to discuss 4 different but interlinked processes through which the Imperial Project achieved its project of colonizing the mind, offering examples to demonstrate how each process works. The first one is through othering. The Indian philosopher Gayatri Spivak offered us conceptual clarity regarding the need of the empire to define itself against those that it is colonizing. She explains that the imperial definition of self is dependent upon its other. The process of othering is a way to enact difference and to justify existing power inequalities in a democratic dispensation. It involves identifying the us from the them in opposition to each other. So how do we learn who we are and how we fit into this us? How do we learn where we stand in the various social hierarchies, racial, gender, class, and so on? It is by learning how to differentiate ourselves from the other. In other words, it is through othering. In her book, Strange Encounters, Sarah Ahmed challenges our common understanding of the term stranger. The Oxford Dictionary defines stranger as, and I quote, a person whom one does not know or with whom one is not familiar. However, Ahmed challenges this definition by arguing that knowledge is constructed in such a way that we know who we are through understanding what we are not. I know I'm white because I'm not black. I am a man because I'm not a woman. I'm well-to-do because I'm not impoverished. I'm straight because I'm not gay. I'm able-bodied because I'm not disabled. So literally, I am because you are not. Our sense of belonging derives from recognizing the difference of the other, the stranger. In that sense, the stranger is socially constructed as someone we already know. For example, I was not a stranger to the group of white male students who made animal grunts and beat their chests at me the other day on a Leuven street. Colonial constructions of my difference had acquainted me to them well before I flew to Belgium a few weeks ago. Their feelings of hatred and fear towards me had been planted in their minds, couched in the positive language of love to their nation, to their community, and to their selves. Instead of teaching them to hate blacks, the imperial power teaches them to love those that are like them, the us. Those young men recognize themselves through a discursive construction of me as out of place, as an alien, and therefore potentially dangerous. My difference sealed their sameness. They viewed me as the other, who threatened the coherence and stability of their community, indeed their nation. The other way is through invisibilization. Colonialism undervalues non-Western forms of knowledge construction and their ways of being, rendering them invisible. What do I mean? Knowledge itself is generally constructed through colonial educational ideals. Indigenous realities, that is ontologies, and ways of knowing, epistemologies, for example, are often ignored and marginalized. Through neocolonial practices, such knowledges are delegitimized and excluded from academic canon. On February 13th this year, I was listening to a BBC News, radio news in my car, and they reported that pangolins, those shy, nocturnal, scaly anteaters, were the most trafficked mammals in the world. The report said, and I quote, "The little-known pangolin is the most trafficked mammal in the world, leading to fears it could become extinct," end quote. Now, the intrinsic contradiction and inconsistency in this report was totally lost on the British scientists and the reporters. If an animal is hunted to the extent of near extinction, logic tells us that its captors must know a great deal about it. Clearly, it is not little known. Never mind that the pangolin, or lugave, as we call it in Uganda, is an important totem, traditionally protected in the Kiganda clan system for centuries, as it is in many other indigenous communities in which this animal was once common. But just as the colonialist Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, and John Speke discovered the source of the Nile, River Nile, in 1858, obviously the native knower of the pangolin does not count. Indigenous knowledge does not qualify as science. The knowledge constructions of indigenous people are at once disappeared and invisibilized. Through binarization and universalization. Imperial construction of human relations is through rigid binary frames: black, white, female, male, feminine, masculine, straight, gay, able-bodied, disabled, rich, poor, beautiful, ugly, etc. And yet we know that humanity is much more complex and diverse than mainstream ideologies would like us to believe. If there is only black and white, then where do you place categories like mixed race, métis, intersex, hijra, bisexual, transgender, without sounding ridiculous? The assumption that there exists a core essence to culture or human nature is just that, an assumption, a wrong assumption. The ontological and epistemological knowledge constructions of indigenous peoples around the world have always understood the complexity, multiplicity, and fluidity of humans. To appreciate what I'm talking about, you just need to read about third genders, such as the hijra of India, the Miyoxes of Mexico, the Mudokodako of Uganda, the Katoi of Thailand, and the two-spirited, or what people derogatively term Badash people, among the Native Americans. All these examples of sex-gender diverse people at once disrupt the binary forms of identity classification current to colonial systems of knowing and of being. They reinscribe binary understandings to a spectrum, the continuum of human experience and learning. They move us from the exclusion implicit in othering to inclusive acknowledgements. The ontological and epistemological binary system that we are exposed to orients us into a normative logic of binary thinking. It locks us into a system of structural inequality whereby we view the us in opposition of some other. The inequality is based on the belief that the other lacks some desirable characteristic that the us has. It is such a mentality that perpetuates exclusionary worldviews, even among colonized communities themselves. There are no essential qualities to being. The reality is that all binary distinctions are strategically constructed and universalized to serve colonial vested interests. The constructed essence or norms are then used as a basis to police and punish those that deviate from the norm. Our identities are many: gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, age, socioeconomic class, ability, marital status, and so on. But we are much more than the sum total of them. The identities that make us who we are intersect multiplicatively, not additively. Our different selves or identities intertwine in complex ways and at various levels to result in dominance and inequalities. I move on to science. Colonizing the mind through science. In the mid-20th century, there was a proliferation of political economy scholarship which sought to analyze the capitalist system. One of the charges that such scholars proffered against science was that it played a key role in legitimizing the interests of colonialism, particularly justifying discrimination. Science lends authority to knowledge claims that become difficult to refute. A good example is evolutionary science that provided the main oxygen to racialist social paradigms. The ideologies that amplify the significance of racial difference are so effective that they are deeply embedded in our psyches, and for most of us, very difficult to shake off. The Caucasian is strategically constructed as superior, while the African is placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, closest to apes in the mapping of species. Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory provided the doctrine for white supremacy. In his 1871 book entitled The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin laced his evolutionary theory with imperial racist and sexist overtones aligned with British colonialism. He described the Western nations of Europe to have, and I quote, so immeasurably surpassed their former savage progenitors and stand at the summit of civilization, end quotes. He then went on to contrast this civilized race to non-European savage races, these are his words, and declared that, I quote, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races through the world, end quotes. Remember, this is 19th century. So such discourse was the moral platform, the raison d'etre that imperialists needed to expand territories, plunder, exploit, enslave, and engage in genocide. Hence, the colonizers convinced themselves and the rest of the world of the white man's burden to civilize the world. Indeed, Darwin's work was welcomed by all colonialists and perpetrators of racist genocide throughout the world. It still guides the thinking of contemporary racist ideologies that wrongly construct evolution as a linear progression. Darwin's sexist theory of sexual selection also attempted to demonstrate the innate passivity of women and their natural subordination. The flaws of this scientific theory were uncovered by a 19th century female scientist, Antoinette Blackwell. The fact is that all living organisms, including humans, plants, and animals, evolved from a single organism, which is now extinct, a single stem from which all living things branch off with adaptations to their environment. Indeed, most indigenous knowledge systems view the social world through a spiritual connection with all life forms. For them, there is no division between matter, mind, and spirit. Many scholars today are beginning to recognize the ecological wisdom embedded in indigenous knowledges and are mobilizing it for sustainable environmental protection. Feminism, for example, has borrowed a leaf from these ancient knowledges. Ecofeminism analyzes the relationship between the oppression of women and the degradation of nature. They view the oppression of women and the environment as twin subordinations and reject the way patriarchal capitalist dualisms separate the body from the mind, males from females, and humans from nature, and creating power imbalances in the process. Race is forced on us. The meaning attached to our skin color and other outward physical attributes is definitely a social construction, an arbitrary fiction. It is a colonial construction based merely on the morphology, that is our general bodily forms and structures of people. Studies have found that two Europeans are not necessarily more likely to be genetically similar. An African and a European may in fact be more genetically similar than any two Europeans. The American Anthropological Association reports, and I quote, "In the United States, both scholars and the general public have been conditioned to viewing human races as natural and separate divisions within the human species based on visible physical differences. With a vast expansion of scientific knowledge in this century, however, it has become clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. Evidence from the analysis of genetics, such as DNA, indicates that most physical variations, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. Conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another only in about 6% of their genes. This means that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them," end quotes. Proof that race has no basis in biology is the fact that at different points in history, Nazi Europe marked Jews and Gypsies as non-Caucasians. The one-drop rule still dominates understandings of race in the US. Are you all familiar with the one-drop rule? The one-drop rule is about the historical legal classification of race in the US. It states that if a person has one drop of African blood, regardless of their phenotypical appearance, they are considered to be black. A white person in Brazil is considered black in the US. And racial identity in apartheid South Africa was assessed using a simplistic pencil test. If a pencil pushed through a person's hair did not fall out, that person was deemed to be a kafir. So historically, constructed races have been used to rationalize privilege, and to stigmatize, to justify prejudices and exclusion. Now let's turn to the process of decolonizing the academy. Decolonization involves the conscious resistance to internalized colonial structures of thought. It is designed to reject essentialization, stereotypes, and biases of colonial-dominated hegemonies. It is a social justice project, but it is quite distinct from the human rights project. While both projects seek social change, the decolonization project recognizes that the historical basis of the human rights project lies in the dominant colonial ideology that it is challenging. Decolonization calls for social transformation that is more disruptive than the quest for human rights. While the human rights project comes from a Western liberal ethic, the project of decolonization recognizes indigenous knowledge frameworks. It entails much more than the simple decolonization of course reading materials. Its purpose is to aid both educators and learners to lift the veil and uncover colonialism and its legacies, articulate critiques of colonial ontologies and epistemology, to analyze colonial histories and values in search of ethics that reject domination and exploitation. Throughout the late 20th century, calls for decolonization and reparation became louder and louder, and by the end of the century could not be ignored. These growing rumblings and unrest among post-colonials have been a source of anxiety to the colonizers, who have started appropriating the language of decolonization and conflating it with the human rights project. Decolonization for the colonizers is cosmetic. It is steeped in liberal understandings of power and democracy. Colonizers have appropriated the term and now treat it as the latest flavor of the month. Tuck and Young describe such half-hearted attempts as metaphors of decolonization, and I quote, they say that the easy adoption of decolonization as a metaphor and nothing else is a form of this anxiety because it is a premature attempt at reconciliation, end quote. This is what the wave of South African student protests in 2015 was about, under the hashtags Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Now that we have some idea, it's okay, we don't have to see. The little going up to the white male. Now that we have some idea of how our minds are colonized, with the educational institutions directly implicated in the process, what are we to do? How can we transform the academy from its current elitist and its dominant colonial paradigms? A paper of this size obviously cannot go into the nuts and bolts details of how to implement decolonization. So what I provide below is a general framework for embarking on the process of decolonization, which would require us to take a very close look at the following. First of all, the politics and ethos of our universities. Does the university put the well-being and dignity of its community members, that is students, faculty, and staff, before profits? Or has the academy become a marketplace for making profit? To what extent are university programs and their curricula geared towards addressing current global and national crises? Does the university aim at producing graduates who are historical conscious and society conscious to fight social inequalities? Does it support open access to knowledge, to multivocal literature, including grey literature, oral documents such as orations, stories, songs, folklore, proverbs, riddles, games, artworks, and ceremonies? I believe that the commodification of knowledge production is criminal. Capitalism will squeeze coins out of anything and exploit anything to make that extra profit. Educators and learners need open access to all published works because no individual can claim to be the exclusive producer of knowledge. We all build on existing knowledge and restate old arguments in different words. We base our conclusions on research data given to us by others, so we do not own that knowledge. Publishers should not make profit off academic publications, as this is public knowledge. We should also look at commitment to alternative pedagogical approaches. The colonial legacy that imposed Eurocentric dominance and situated as the universal epistemological paradigm is clearly evident in current pedagogical approaches in our academies. The relationship between lecturers and students, as well as the methods of teaching, should be democratic, inclusive, validating the voices of all learners. Pedagogical methods should promote cognitive, holistic learning beyond dichomatized approaches and rote content knowledge. Liberatory teaching methods should hone the critical thinking skills of learners. Unlearning or conscientization requires exposure to knowledge and understanding of the historical processes of colonial domination and Western modernity. Such histories would unlock the concealed truths about the Western modernity project, which was achieved at the great expense of indigenous populations. Unlearning entails appreciating indigenous knowledge systems and their ways of being, which were subordinated by coloniality. Unlearning also means that we consciously and constantly engage in self-reflection, questioning all assumptions and prejudices underlying colonially constructed truths. Finally, it entails resisting from perpetuating essentializing stereotypes about colonized people. Conscientization through dialogue between the lecturer and the students is a process of two-way learning, knowing and theorizing about their shared experiences. In reimagining our decolonized academies, we must take care not to simply graft indigenous knowledge onto dominant colonial approaches. Deel advises that we take a multicentricity approach where we devise, and I quote, a response strategy approach that seeks ways of integrating different knowledges so that we have a synthesis or a coexistence of multiple bodies of knowledge circulating as part of the contestations of knowledge systems, end quote. The idea is not to simply introduce a separate course on indigenous knowledge systems, but rather to integrate them in all university disciplines. And because the ultimate goal of decolonization is social justice, elements of indigenous knowledge that reinforce inequalities must be rejected. Achieving all this would not only require the retraining of lecturers, but also making space for custodians of indigenous knowledges in the academy. Commitment to acknowledging and the inclusivity of diversities. Decolonization requires that we are more tolerant of diversity and pluralism. Here, we are not talking about cosmetic or tokenistic approaches to diversity. Is there an affirmative action program, for example, in your university to achieve quantitative and qualitative equity? For example, are there plans to incorporate disadvantaged and alienated groups, such as women, people of color, LGBTIQ, the impoverished at all levels, administration, student, lecturers, staff? What about academic support programs to counter the effects of schooling deficits? In discussing decolonization of the academy, Deel speaks of voice affirmation, authenticity of selves, epistemic saliency of the experience of the colonized populations. The academy should recognize the intellectual agency of colonial subjects and the validity of learning beyond oneself and the self-referential. D, the politics that shape research. The academy is a hub of scholarly research which powerfully shapes discourse and is heavily relied upon for public policy and governance. Do the theoretical connotations of the research conducted in your university perpetuate colonial concepts, stereotypes, imaginaries, and cover-ups? The dominant positivist paradigm in both the hard and social sciences emphasizes objectivity and a dichotomy between subject and object. It depicts social reality as being out there and calls for scientific approaches of obtaining such reality through unrealistic detachment and objectivity. It presupposes abstract researchers that are devoid of history and are unaffected by culture, gender, and cultural structures. These colonial patriarchal ways of relating to the world are extremely problematic as they tend to produce skewed and biased knowledge. We need to adopt ethical, non-positivist intellectual paradigms that acknowledge subjective interpretations of reality and are commensurate with indigenous knowledge systems. We need to fully understand the reasons behind the facts before we can engender social transformation. To conclude, colonization of the mind was possible because Europe had the power to impose its version of the world on other communities around the world. That imposition was achieved through brute force, and even more powerfully, through the imaginative force, that is hegemony. Politics plays a very important role in the construction of knowledge. Decolonization of the academy and of the mind must be seen as only a first step. Given how embedded and ubiquitous dominant colonial knowledges, values, and languages are, decolonization appears to be a huge and daunting project. In order to unhinge the deep systemic colonial structures and assumptions, a careful, systematic decolonization program has to be devised. Today, a rich body of literature exists on decolonization that provides us with theoretical and practical guidelines on how such programs may unfold. Decolonized knowledge production should benefit from a cross-pollination of ideas, values, and perspectives, taking into account the dynamism of all knowledge systems. For instance, local knowledges regarding soil types, vegetation patterns, plant pharmacology, and architectural designs may instruct us on sustainable environmental practices. When the academy ignores the debilitating legacies of colonialism, when it works to defend and whitewash colonialism, it is directly complicit in perpetuating colonial oppression and colonial discourses. Such transformative changes will, of course, invoke emotive resistance and cynicism, especially from the minority that benefit from colonial legacies. But ultimately, decolonizing the mind and the academy will benefit the broader world community and lead to more just societies. Our university mottos should not be based on the tradition of "I am because you are not," but rather on the non-colonial ethos of "I am because we are." Thank you very much.
Okay, we're still trying to figure out how we'll work with the microphone, but it is okay.
The battery's down.
But I would really like to thank the Professor Sylvia Tamale for her wonderful lecture. As we promised, we are going to do a Q&A. And so I hope that you all have a lot of questions. And of course, I would like to remind you that she didn't speak on the topic of the LGBTQIA situation in Uganda in her presentation, but she did remind you that you could always ask those questions during the Q&A itself. So if you have any questions, then you may raise your hand and I'll try and we'll see if the microphone is working. But if you have questions, then I'll repeat them into the microphone so that everybody can hear them. Any questions? I'll come with the microphone.
Good evening, Professor. Good evening, everybody. My name is Makerere University and I am currently an advanced master's student in cultural anthropology and development studies. Thank you so much for your lecture. It really reminded me of a book I read by Professor Marimba Ani called Urugu, who really deconstructs how European thought was weaved and formed and how it differentiated darkness from light, black from white, and how blackness or Africanness was not as superior as whiteness, and how the university came about. The word university in itself signifying one type of knowledge, which is European type of knowledge, which is what drives the knowledge basis of where we're living. But just to cut the long story short, I remember standing on my previous campus at the University of Cape Town in 2015 when the Rhodes Must Fall movement was unfolding. And the moment when the statue was being removed, I had so many questions in my mind because at that time I had just begun my first master's in anthropology. And I didn't quite understand the reason behind the Rhodes Must Fall movement until later on when I started seeing the type of stuff at the university that didn't really make sense to me. For instance, I'd been at UCT since my first year in 2011, and I didn't realize that African scholars and African knowledge housed in the university library was actually in the basement, and it has been in the basement for so long, and we had been reading white philosophers' work, which was on the main floor of the library, first of all. And I'm a master's student. I have read nothing about African anthropology, number one. So that was quite mind-boggling for me. But also, I found it quite ironic that as a Black female African, I was an anthropologist. Anthropology, which was like historically led by white males. I'm a Black female anthropologist. And I started to think about the research methods that have been used over centuries to study the other. And I started to question whether I am not replicating the same methods that previous white anthropologists have been using. And till today, I'm still a bit uncomfortable as a Black female anthropologist. I'm still very uncomfortable studying other people. I'm still very scared to replicate the same methods as previous anthropologists have been doing. I know we've there has been some change over the years, but I still think anthropology hasn't moved far enough to kind of transform to the extent of even Black anthropologists like myself to be comfortable to study other people in my own continent. So what is your take on Black anthropologists being comfortable in their position researching themselves or researching people on the continent?
I share the same anxiety as you do, but I think as scholars and researchers, I think as long as we take care to not treat the people that we are studying as objects, and to be very open about our subjective interpretation of what it is that we are, the knowledge that we are acquiring in the field. In other words, as we have to be ethical about the work that we do. And unfortunately, after so many decades of so many critiques of disciplines like anthropology and how it does its work, it's amazing, it's just shocking how very little has changed. How indigenous people are still exoticized, there's exotic others. And, the attitudes. So I think that is why this decolonizing the mind is so important. Because, it's colonial ways of thinking have become part of our DNA. It is so deeply ingrained, embedded in our psyches, in our, thought processes that, you go to a place and, you want to know about, how they do sex and how, things that you would never ask people who are like you. Because, these are exotic people who are different, who do things differently. So, in short, I think the short answer is you have to be very ethical about the work that you do. And you have to be very conscious of the dominant position, your dominant status as an elite scholar, researcher, who is trying to extract information from, people whose lives you're disrupting and who, your interventions may not be very welcome. It is very tricky. But I think the important thing is to be aware of those, the politics, and to take measures to minimize them as much as possible, because you can't eliminate them entirely.
Hello, my name is Sebastian. Thank you very much for that, very interesting lecture. I have two things that come to mind, and I have two questions combined to that. First of all, it sounds a little bit too easy, and all this dualism about the oppressed, the oppressors, about the colonized and the colonizers. But the point is, if you just take Uganda, Uganda has 60 plus different languages, ethnic groups, and so on, right? And it always sounds a little bit like that we and the others, as if, and we only take now Uganda, that is one entity, one homogeneous entity, but it is not. I mean, they are Choli, they are Baganda, they are all these different people, and if you listen to some Baganda in Kampala speaking about the Karamojong, you get that sounds a little bit scary, of how they speak about their own fellow Ugandans. And the question I would like to add to that would be like, how would you factor that one in? I mean, Africa was once called the 100,000 kingdoms or chiefdoms. How would you factor that one into any concept of decolonization, where you said like, okay, we need to carefully devise a decolonizing strategy? Number two, I agree with you with a lot of things, and there are undoubtedly huge challenges ahead. But as you put it, it sounds a little bit like African countries have no agency at all. And how would you assess the responsibility of the current political ruling classes? Let's now again stick to Uganda, to some of the challenges and problems Uganda faces today. The LGBT is only one example, the LGBT situation in Uganda, but also in terms of economy and other things, the roads in Kampala, by the way. How would you assess then also the responsibility of those people? I mean, Uganda, I mean, we go back maybe not to the independence, but 86 when Museveni came to power, and there was a lot of time to change things. yeah, also in Makerere University and other places. But there were a lot of things being decided apart from, like, not being introduced by the colonial class. So how would you assess the responsibility of local ruling classes in the time of independence? Thank you.
Okay. I talked about compradors, the local compradors who are really agents. I'm beginning with your last question. Who are agents of colonialism, who do the bidding for colonialists, who make it easy and efficient for them to come back and extract and exploit the ruling elite. So that's all part of the infrastructure of colonialism, or neo-colonialism, and now through neoliberalism. On the issue of Uganda, how the Baganda, for example, treat the Karimajongo, you're absolutely right. And I talked about it. I talked about how the colonial ways of thinking, their knowledge structures, knowledge frameworks, which emphasize dualism, which emphasize us, them, have also affected the colonial people. I don't want to in any way romanticize that, you know, there was no divisions before colonialism came, but today it is much more emphasized because of that thinking, that way of thinking that, you know, it's us and them. So
the conflicts in the Turkana region date way back before the colonial encounter.
Yes, but then when you talk about Uganda as a nation, again, you have to go back into history and look at how that nation was put together. It was really Humpty Dumpty being glued together, and very, very arbitrarily. And in many African countries, you know, you have on the borders, you have one family being Kenyan and their cousins, blood cousins, first cousins. The border just arbitrarily put them in Kenya, but the same family. So, in other words, you know, achieving national, you know, the nation, the way the nations were constructed in Europe was very different from how they were constructed in the colonies. In the colonies, they were forced together. Here, there was much more, you know, it was a long, you know, after the wars and so on, the religious wars and so on, the way that nations were put together followed some kind of pattern of some homogeneity that is very different from how, you know, nations were put together in a Humpty Dumpty style in Africa and other colonial, colonies. So, you know, the way that we relate to each other, the different tribes relate to each other, I think has a lot to do with that history, together with, and it's made worse, but by, you know, the dominant ways of thinking that it's us and them, you know, and we are superior to them. And it's not just through tribes. It intersects, you know, age, sexual orientation, and so on. But that type of thinking. That's why when we talk about decolonization, we are trying to erase this, which as I said, is a daunting task. And I think it's easier to do with our children than with us, because shaking it off really has to be a very, very conscious process that we undertake.
Would you consider
to redraw the borders. You remember I talked about decolonization at 2 levels, and I only dealt with the second one of the mind. I didn't look at that first one, which is a total different cup of tea, totally different. I was following you until the very end. The question. Mm-hmm. Are you asking how do we integrate indigenous knowledge systems into what we have today? Because what I'm actually saying is that what we have today, we need to dismantle. It's very problematic because what it's doing, it's at the service of colonial oppression. So I'm saying we can't continue with it. So we have to have different ways of thinking. Well, I don't know what you mean by hybrids, but what I'm saying, let's take an example. I think examples always help. When the way that the current colonial knowledge systems, Western liberal system, how it constructs, for example, sexuality as a binary. This, you know, your heterosexuality being the dominant, and others being policed, and in many countries criminalized. Now, if you take for example, the examples that I gave in India, the Hijra, for example, and understand that actually there are communities, because the first time I discovered that there are actually communities that, as a matter of course, recognize that we don't have two genders. Once you recognize that, then your way of thinking about sex and gender will be completely different. It will move from this binary, either this or that, to a spectrum. And you would understand that, humanity falls on a continuum, not two extremes. And that constructing gender and sexuality using a different knowledge system changes everything. It just changes the way you think about it. You see, the problem is we need to get into it to understand it. For example, the philosophy of Ubuntu, it rejects this individualism. Okay? So you really, I think we need to get into those knowledge systems in order to understand how they work and how different they are. Because what you're doing now is, if we reject this one, how will the others work? We have to know those others. Remember the days when I quoted Deel, when he says it should be centric, I am saying reject colonial frameworks. But when I talk about indigenous, you seem to think that Western people are not indigenous. Western people also have their indigenous ways of knowing that are not colonial, necessarily colonial. So when I talk about indigenous, I'm including the Dutch indigenous ways of knowing, which were not necessarily colonial, and so on. So it is not, when I talk about indigenous, I think what conjures up in your mind is non-white people. But indigenous ways of knowing, I am actually, what I am saying is that we must reject the colonial ways of learning and just reject it and get new, fresh ways of thinking. And I'm referring to those as indigenous, including some of those will come from the West, but not non-colonial.
Hi, I'm Lynn. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa, and I'd like to respond to the conversation because to me, decolonized academia has a completely different meaning. I was educated in South Africa. When I was in school, I wasn't allowed to learn in the language of my choice. The history that we learned was history that was brought over, and stories were untold, stuff that I had to learn when I left high school on my own. So decolonization means for me that my kids have a chance to learn about their own indigenous knowledges and their own stories. They are learning African languages that I don't know because I had to learn German that I never use. We learned German and French for 3 years in high school.
Did you learn about Shaka Zulu?
No, not at all. Most
That's
of the
what I
time
was saying. You need to go back into history
when my
to know
kids
who we are.
are doing homework, I'm learning things with them, and I have to go read up on my own history and stuff I had to educate myself with. So when I think about decolonization in academia, which is a topic I work with in South Africa now, it means replacing 100% of knowledge that has been imported and balancing it with local knowledge. It doesn't mean doing away, it means adding to. It's about replacing our complete realities with other things also, other ways of knowing. And we have to think about ways of teaching and teaching in ways that are more accessible. I can't use just lecturing and that way of teaching with my students when it's innate for us as Africans to connect with storytelling and to connect with art and to connect with ways of doing. And so I have to introduce that into the classroom. If I think about what's been happening now in South Africa in the last week, there was a paper that was published, I don't know if anybody saw that on Twitter, about colored women being at risk for being unintelligent. And it says that in the title. It was funded by the NRF, it was passed by my own university's ethics committee, and it was published in an international journal. And that speaks to the essence of decolonization not happening at an academic level. Conversations need to happen. Supervisors need to be conscious and aware of their biases when they are teaching students. Publishers need to think about what they are exposing so that people are learning. It's not okay to publish something that speaks about one race group and identifies them and says it's probably because of their low education. So I do think this is an important conversation, and it doesn't mean that other knowledge systems have to be threatened, but it needs to make room for more ways of knowing.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm from Uganda as well, and I want to thank you for the amazing lecture put in place.
Okay.
You mentioned how religion was one of the aspects that were used to push colonization, and with decolonization and the pushing of it, how do you expect religion will sort of come into it? Like, what would religion look like with decolonization going
Which religion?
just religion in general? Oh, let's take Christianity. How
You know, I think all indigenous knowledge systems had their own spirituality, their own religions, which, of course, were subordinated and termed kafar, you know, there are all kinds of derogatory terms and, you know, rejected and, you know, through, and then, you know, were forced to take on their religion, the colonial religion. So are you asking where's the place of colonial religion in decolonization? Because a lot of interpretation, religion is used to, or misused, to justify and rationalize discrimination and oppression. Oppression of women, oppression of LGBTQ, even apartheid South Africa based, even apartheid in the US used the Bible to justify. So it is abused. It's you know, you read in Romans, it justifies the rulers are from God and you have to listen to them and pay taxes, and you know, you go to church and the priest is telling you to accept this dictator because Romans says so. You know, it is manipulated. It is used to justify, and you know, it's something. It is so sacred that people don't dare challenge religion. It is so sacred, and that's why it's so effective. I think we need to challenge the way Christianity is interpreted, just as Islam is interpreted to perpetuate domination and oppression and discrimination, and to legitimize those religions that were invisibilized and subordinated. People's spirituality, you know, some of it was even, you know, criminalized in colonial laws. The way people's ways of, you know, their religions, their indigenous religions. So it has a very precarious position in the decolonization project because of its role in colonizing minds.
So you're saying that a better to let go of the interpretations that have been placed on the world and take on the spiritualities and the religions that were.
At a minimum, learn about those other religions, because right now you don't know anything about them because they were suppressed. In fact, you know, if you go to church at home, they'll tell you those pagan, you know, those worshipping, and you know, everything derogatory about them. So just learn about, you know, this traditional spirituality and what it was about, at a minimum. Because right now, all we know are those dominant Christianity and Islam, the Abrahamic religions.
Okay, so the last question.
My best, but I'm a bit of a native speaker. Hello, my name is Tim. Thank you for the lecture and to the speaker for introducing. I was just recently at this small symposium, also at this university, even though, well, every speaker was a student, but a question that popped up by the Q&A by a black person was that what anthropology, in particular, it was an anthropology symposium, what anthropology seems to always shy away from is to sort of assert itself and its theories of decolonization, of the post-colonial subject, things like that, to assert themselves into public discourse. And the subject matter of this lecture was decolonization in academia. I can understand that, but I'm seeing sort of a pattern that that talk of decolonization is always it always insulates itself, or even if it doesn't want to. So it either sort of limits itself to particular intellectual groups or to academia, wherein even in academia it really it's really going at a turtle's pace, which
No, I haven't. That's a simple answer. First of all, I'm not on social media. But I think if we are talking about decolonizing academia, yes, we should involve others because we want their knowledges into the academy. But I think we should start with ourselves. You know, we really need to understand what the project is about and to appreciate what we are up against. Because we are up against very, very powerful forces. These are ways of knowing that have been in the academy for centuries, and now we are challenging them. It's not going to be easy. So I think you take this as a beginning, and if you believe in even a little bit of what we are discussing here tonight, take yourself as one of the advocates and see what you can do. Each one of us has to do their bit, but we're up against very, very powerful forces. As I said, I had professors in university who rejected the liberal theories and were teaching us political economy, the law, showing us how the law serves the colonial project. But that's a small, they don't even cause a dent because the dominant, all the other law professors were using positivist methods of teaching the law, black letter law, and this is the law without. So it's a very daunting project. I think we need to appreciate that first and foremost. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Undivided team for being so patient with us, especially with the technical difficulties in the beginning, and sorry for running over time. But we'd like to thank you for your presence tonight. It was really, really amazing to see such a diverse audience and such an interactive audience as well. I'd also like to thank Professor Sylvia Tamale for taking her time, for preparing everything, and for really taking her time to respond to all of the very, very interesting questions. And I hope that it was also as educative to everybody in here as it was for myself. So thank you once again, Professor Sylvia Tamale. And we brought this for you.
Wow, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, the rain was a bit
Thank you.
too much
Thank you
today.
very much.
Yes, and we also brought you some pralines.